Welcome to Spoonie Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Courtney Craig. My guest today is a clinical professor of medicine at the University of Iowa, where she teaches internal medicine residents, sees patients in a traumatic brain injury clinic, and conducts clinical trials. She's also a patient with secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, which confined her to a tilt-recline wheelchair for 4 years. Using diet and lifestyle changes, she restored her health and now pedals her bike to work each day. She's the author of the bestseller, The Wahls Protocol, How I Beat Progressive MS Using Paleo Principles and Functional Medicine, and teaches the public and medical community about the healing power of intensive nutrition. And she's here today to do just that. I'd like to welcome to the show Dr. Terry Wahls.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Now, I first heard you speak and tell your story about 2 years ago at the Ancestral Health Symposium, and that was the first time that I'd heard of you and heard about this wonderful story. And I was immediately touched and moved because I heard so many similar things in your story as what I experienced with my own illness, because I too used functional medicine and paleo principles to basically beat a 15-year diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. And I do want to talk a little bit today, later on, about the similarities between the two illnesses. But just to start, if you could explain to our listeners, what is MS? What are the different subtypes of MS?
Sure. So multiple sclerosis is a autoimmune disorder attacking the brain and the spinal cord. 80% of people will be diagnosed initially with relapsing remitting, which means you have an acute episode of worsening called a relapse. Your body is able to slowly adapt to adding sodium channels, and so it can work, although somewhat less effectively, and symptoms reduce. That's called a remission. 10% are diagnosed with primary progressive. They never have an acute worsening, only a very gradual decline. And there is no FDA-approved drug treatments that change the course of primary progressive. And the longer you have relapsing and remitting, the more likely it is you will convert to the progressive form of the disease, secondary progressive, where the decline continues despite treatment. And after 10 to 15 years of diagnosis, the vast majority of those with relapsing remitting have converted to secondary progressive multiple sclerosis.
Now, I've always been intrigued with the similarities between these two illnesses, multiple sclerosis and CFS. Although CFS is not classically defined as an autoimmune condition, we still see similar things, both immune cell dysfunction, similar cytokine patterns, and similar symptom clusters clinically. This is more common in females, the debilitating fatigue, there's pain, cognitive fog, all of these similar symptom clusters. And it's fun to intellectually think about these things, but what I want to really get at is, what do you think is going on here? What is the root cause of these things?
And would you like me to comment on the root cause of both?
Well, these chronic illnesses and autoimmunity, these poorly defined conditions that we see.
Well, for generations, hundreds of generations, physicians have been classifying diseases based on the patient's story, the physical findings, and gradually we began to add more and more lab tests. Now scientists are able to look inside the cells to understand the molecular changes, such as the cytokine, and we see the cellular changes with increased inappropriate inflammation, evidence of mitochondrial strain, oxidative stress. We see that the presence of toxic load in the body worsens these symptoms. The presence of chronic infections also worsen these symptoms. And part of what is surprising to the scientists is that at the cellular level, molecular level, these diseases look more and more alike. I'm talking about a very common excessive inappropriate inflammation, very common mitochondrial dysfunction, very common disease worsening by toxin exposure and body burden. From the neurological disease, that includes bipolar, schizophrenia, mood disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, autism, learning disabilities. On the medical side, it includes high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune conditions, Parkinson's. What I think we need to begin to look at the root causes of diseases, look at mitochondrial function, look at nutritional issues, and look at toxic load issues, chronic infection issues, and deal with all those root causes instead of only dealing with the name, diagnosis, treated symptoms, and not uncovering the root causes that probably led to the inflamed, sickly, disease-prone body.
Right, absolutely. And we're seeing a shift, I think, in thinking and in the way that medicine is practiced. And it's really a recent idea that chronic disease is inflammatory in nature. And I heard one of your interviews on another show, you mentioned that we might be learning that a lot of chronic disease is autoimmune in nature. So I wonder if you could speak more to that. What does that mean for those that do have an autoimmune illness? Do we need a new definition of this term autoimmunity?
Well, every year we are adding more and more diseases to the possibly autoimmune, and then moving the possibly autoimmune to probable, and probable to definite autoimmunity. And you can sort of step back for a moment and think about inflammation, which is the body's response to traumatized tissue or tissue that has been damaged through infection. And the immune cells will go in, dissolve the damaged tissue, and assist in the rebuilding of those damaged tissues. So that's normal, healthy immune response that we all must have to do our ongoing repair that's required to maintain our bodies. What is abnormal is when the tissues appear to be physiologically normal, yet our immune cells go in and begin dissolving and replacing or attacking those seemingly normal tissues. That's clearly a reflection of autoimmunity. For example, most of my colleagues do not think of high blood pressure or atherosclerosis as an autoimmune disease. And yet, if you go to PubMed and you search for autoimmunity and atherosclerosis, you'll see that this is a very hot and exciting area of research in terms of understanding the atherosclerosis and high blood pressure changes as an inflammatory response that's appropriate, therefore an autoimmune response.
That's really interesting and cutting edge and outside of the box thinking, which I love. And I feel like your whole message is rather out of the box. You have this wild idea that food can fix everything on a cellular level. So let's talk more about what is your Wahls protocol. How does food fit into this picture?
Well, food, we're alive because of chemistry, this wonderful self-correcting chemistry that can keep the concentration of calcium, sodium, potassium, magnesium in a very narrow range inside the cell, outside of the cell. If it gets outside of those ranges, we become very ill and die. Now, that chemistry happens because of the food that we eat and the food we don't eat. And also add the toxins to which we're exposed that can confuse our chemistry. In 1700, humans ate less than 10 pounds of sugar in a year. In 2000, we ate 153 pounds of sugar per person per year. Our children ate even more than that. And we eat 109 pounds of white flour in a year. All of those calories are empty calories that our species would never have seen before 10,000 years ago, that really drive up the inflammation, create epigenetic changes on our DNA, and displaces from our diet the foods that would have provided the vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, essential fats amino acids that our cells need to conduct the biology of life properly.
Now, this is sounding a lot like a traditional paleo diet, nutrient-dense paleo diet, but you describe your dietary approach as a modified paleo diet and intensive nutrition. So how is your approach a little different than the typical paleo approach that we see?
So many of the paleo authors spend a lot of time explaining why you need to remove grain, legumes, and dairy from the diet, and then tell you to eat meat and vegetables. They don't give people a lot of structure on how to organize those dietary choices. Yeah, and in fact, when Dr. Jason Kelton did a detailed nutritional analysis of modern diets, the American Heart, the ADA, South Beach, Atkins, Practical Paleo, as described by San Filippo, and Primal Blueprint, as described by Mark Sisson, he found that the paleo diets were among the most nutrient-dense he analyzed. Great news. But they still missed 56% of the RDAs. Pardon me, they only met 56% of the RDAs. So they missed 40%. That's really quite huge. What I've done that is different from all of the other paleo authors is I went to this literature and through functional medicine, through my review of the basic science literature, we identified what now basically 36 nutrients that I track and monitor that I know brain cells need. Then we create a food plan, menus, recipes, analyze how many nutrients were delivered, and confirmed that we met the needs for those 31 nutrients. And so we exceed the RDAs, 1.5 to 9 times, which looks very similar to a free living traditional hunter-gatherer society. I've confirmed my claims. No one else has done that. No one else has the research lab to validate what brain cells need and that their eating plan will in fact provide them.
Wow, those are big differences. I wasn't familiar with those numbers. And one thing I know that you also stress is that's different, I think, from the traditional paleo is your diet is much more higher in fats. So what role does that high fat intake have on the cellular level?
So what I do in my book is I help people transition from their current diet into progressively more health-promoting, brain-protecting diet. At the highest level, I've created a ketogenic diet where I stress, and I talk a lot about the critical role of fat. You see, every cell in my body has a fat wrapper around it of phospholipids. In that fat wrapper is 60 to 70% cholesterol saturated fat and 10% omega-6 and omega-3 fats. To have the healthiest membranes, we want to have cholesterol saturated fat, omega-6 and omega-3 fats. And this fixation on a low-fat diet has really been starving our cell membranes, putting us at much higher risk for brain-related problems, earlier cognitive decline, earlier memory loss, neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's, and chronic fatigue and brain fog that's not been clearly diagnosed.
Right. Fat is so crucial. And thankfully, we're finally getting away from fat phobia. I think we've seen it in the media here in the coming weeks. So hopefully that trend will be changing. Now, what about animal fats and animal proteins here? Is this diet something that's feasible for people who follow vegetarian diets?
Well, I have several interesting perspectives on that. So I had a 20-year vegetarian history. And the way I practiced my vegetarian diet, I had plenty of grains and legumes. I didn't eat much bread. It was whole grains, whole legumes, plenty of vegetables, not a lot of sugar, not a lot of white flour. But clearly, as the way I practiced it, I think I put myself at risk for low B12 and inappropriate omega-3, omega-6 ratios, and probably not enough protein. However, I also note that one of my research assistants is vegetarian for religious reasons, and that really challenged me to reach out to those who I know are not going to go back to eating meat because of their spiritual beliefs. So we did create a program that a vegetarian vegan could follow. I also gave them some clear guidance on how to reduce the risk of lectins and phytates, address their B12 and protein concerns. And I did invite them that if they had a chronic health problem as a vegetarian, the way they were interpreting their vegetarian diet could very well be a large part of their illness. So I do think eating meat is a complete protein, particularly if it's grass-fed, wild game, wild fish, has many, many health benefits. But I will also agree that it is possible to be a vegetarian or a vegan if done carefully and still have excellent health. Now, some people with autoimmunity are going to have a lot more difficulty achieving that if they have food sensitivities to those grains and legumes.
Another thing that you stress in your book, and I think that's kind of the one thing that most people are familiar with, is you recommend a ton of vegetables, something like 6 to 8 cups of vegetables a day.
Yes.
How it's hard enough to eat, half of that. What are your tips for people to increase their vegetable intake?
Well, if you take out grains and starches, so you're eating non-starchy vegetables, berries, and meat according to appetite, you'll do pretty well. I've learned to tell people 6 to 12 ounces of meat according to your size and gender, and then eat non-starchy vegetables and berries according to your appetite. With the target, if you're a tall lady like me or a man, 9 cups of vegetables. Or if you're a more petite lady, it might be 5 to 6 cups of vegetables, or perhaps even 4. It will also depend on if you're in the ketogenic phase of the diet, then of course we do reduce the carbs further.
And another thing you've stressed is sulfur-rich foods. What's the role of sulfur in all of this?
So the sulfur-containing food groups I talk a lot about, the cabbage family, onion family, mushroom family, these 3 food groups have been medicinal foods across many cultures for many millennia. And these sulfur compounds, thiols, are very important in the processing, eliminating of toxins. It's very important in the generation of glutathione antioxidants within the cell. And it's very important for the generation of nerve neurotransmitters. So that has many critical roles in the body in terms of how we run our chemistry. In addition, these compounds will go speak to my DNA through epigenetic changes, turning some genes on, other genes off, which also has a profound impact on the way my cells will run the chemistry of life. It will greatly influence whether I'm tilted towards repair or if I'm tilted towards inflammation and destruction.
Right. Food is biochemistry. I want to talk a little bit more about glutathione because that's one nutrient that's used clinically in chronic fatigue patients. They're given it intravenously. Some take supplements. What is your opinion of supplemental glutathione? Is it something that you utilize for your own condition or recommend?
Well, so if you eat these sulfur-containing compounds, one of the enzymes that you induce is glutathione synthetase. So getting your 3 cups of sulfur in will greatly support your ability to generate more glutathione. You can take glutathione in a liposomal form, and there are a variety of products out there that allow you to absorb some of that glutathione directly. If you take it in a tablet form, your stomach and intestines will digest it down to the component parts. You'll absorb that and have to reconstruct it, so it'll be less effective. Using N-acetylcysteine or taurine, some of the sulfur amino acids, can directly boost that.
Now, are there any other supplements that you recommend for people dealing with autoimmunity and chronic illness? It seems like most of your protocol relies only on foods, but do you think supplementation has a role in this as well?
I think personalized supplementation can be very helpful. I think it's extraordinarily challenging to make a public health recommendation that will be good for everyone. So in my alternative medicine supplement chapter, I spend a fair amount of time talking about how to speak with your personal physician, how to request some basic labs that a primary care doc would feel comfortable ordering, to follow your progress, give people targets and suggested interventions to get to that target, and when they would need to work with a functional medicine doc. I think that in my experience, people do far better if things are personalized based on either some lab testing and a history, understanding the person's personal history and their family history to predict which enzymes are likely to be working less effectively and would benefit from taking supplements. The challenge with supplements is that my cells see food mostly in ratios for the vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and nutrients. The absolute value has impact, ratio has more impact. So, for example, if you read that zinc, which is involved in about 200 enzymatic steps in my brain, very important, you need to have it. So I read that zinc's critical, I go, okay, I'll start taking zinc. So I start taking 50 milligrams of zinc every day. I will eventually make myself copper depleted. And copper, because zinc and copper are linked, and it's the ratio zinc to copper that really drives how well my chemistry works through the zinc and copper functions. As soon as we begin taking a supplement, we run the risk of getting the ratios wrong. Mm-hmm. So you have to be thoughtful about supplement use. If you rely on food, that's going to be fine because the ratio will be correct. If you use history and exam and some lab testing to guide which supplements, and then monitor to know when you've got the person replete so you can back off, that will be more helpful.
That's great advice. I agree with that. Some people just take so many supplements. You know, I'm guilty of this too. I was taking 40 supplements a day at one point, and eventually I had to evaluate and say, wait a second, what am I doing? Is this really making an impact? And then you look closer at the biochemistry, and you can really create a personalized plan that is actually, I think, more effective.
Yeah.
Another thing that you mentioned that's part of your protocol is the role of exercise. Now, this is an extremely controversial topic in the chronic fatigue community because only a very, very small subset of these patients can tolerate exercise because with any sort of exertion, we experience post-exertional malaise, flu-like symptoms, and can just go into severe relapse. So there's a lot of fear surrounding exercise and a lot of uncertainty of what causes it. So I'm wondering if we see this kind of thing going on in MS, and what advice would you give to people who can't exercise or have this fear of even trying to gradually exercise?
So in our clinical trials, in the first trial that we did, we designed an exercise program based on where the person was at, and we added electrical stimulation of muscles to that exercise program, and then would gradually increase the electrical therapy time and the exercise time as recovery happened. We did see that we had to be very careful in personalizing. Some of our folks were so disabled that a 5-minute exercise program was all they could do. We have everyone spend time stretching. We didn't count that stretching time as part of the exercise time. And then we'd start the exercise. Again, we were very attentive listening to our subjects as to how much exercise they could do and still function in that day. And if we had too much exercise so they couldn't function, we kept backing off the time. And that's how we got to people with severe disability would start with only a 5-minute exercise program.
Now, talk more about this electrical muscle stimulation. I'm very interested in this. Could this be replaced as exercise?
Well, there are devices called functional electrical stimulation devices that are used in people who have a traumatic spinal cord injury and are paralyzed, and they will do cycling either with their arms or their legs using electrical current to the muscles entirely. And in doing that, they can maintain the health of the muscle, the health of the bone, have more favorable cholesterol markers, inflammation markers, better insulin sensitivity. And as actually was reviewing those studies that got me talking to my physical therapist about doing e-stim for myself. What I have learned is if you exercise, contract that muscle while you're stimulating it, you get much more improvement in muscle strength, muscle endurance. So our advice to patients was to do a voluntary muscle contraction at the same time as the electrical contraction. If we would, people who are more severely disabled, we might have them do 10 voluntary contractions and then quit doing the voluntary contraction and let the electrical therapy continue for the 5-minute duration. People will do much better if they do a volitional contraction during the electrical contraction.
This is very interesting from my chiropractic perspective, and I'd like to explore this more and see maybe some people using this in clinical practice, especially for fibromyalgia patients that have small fiber neuropathy. Another effect of exercise is its stimulation of brain-derived neurotropic factors or brain growth factors. And this is something that I think is very important for both MS and CFS patients. And I've written about this recently because there was a new study that came out just this last year looking at a group of CFS patients and a group of MS patients, and they measured BDNF levels. And BDNF was severely depleted in the CFS group compared to the MS group. So what is your opinion of this brain-derived neurotropic factor, and what are some ways that we can boost our levels?
Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, physical activity, particularly intervals where you've been running for your life, is probably the most powerful stimulator of nerve growth factor. Strength training comes next. Mental learning would come next. Aerobic training, low-level activity comes next. And from a evolutionary standpoint, before agriculture, women traveled 2 to 3 miles a day, men 6 to 9 miles a day, and so there was considerable physical activity. And we certainly find those who have less physical activity have markedly less nerve growth factor. In animal models, we can see that doing electrical therapy, electrical stimulation of muscles, will increase nerve growth factor locally and in the brain. There have been no human studies that have looked at that, and I think it's unlikely that we'll have that because I don't think people are going to consent to get a spinal tap before and after e-stim. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I don't think so. So another important thing with the nerve growth factor is its effect on cognition and improving brain fog and this whole idea of mind-body medicine that is we're still figuring out. So what role does mind-body medicine have in your protocol?
Well, in my book's in 3 parts, and the first couple chapters talk a lot about conventional medicine, functional medicine, and how the worldview of health and disease differs to those 2 diseases. And then the 3rd chapter, I talk about the internal motivation, that we need to really examine why we want to do this, what our higher purposes in life are, and encourage developing a journal that you can keep as you go through this process. There is, to my mind, no question that stress-reducing practices are important because high cortisol is going to lead to brain atrophy, inflammation, etc. And their purpose, understanding your internal motivation, is also absolutely critical.
Yeah, I love the example of the diary that you mentioned in your book. Not only because it encourages you to collect a lot of data on yourself, looking at your symptoms each day, and so you can go back and see how you're improving, but also you include things like a gratitude practice each day. And I think that's wonderful. And we're seeing there's actually clinical research that shows that increases things like growth factor and improves symptom outcomes.
Yes. It helps improve the parasympathetic outflow. It improves heart rate variability as well, the gratitude practice. So a lot of physiologic parameters improve with that.
Absolutely, and it's such a simple, free thing that someone can do every single day, which is also excellent. And as I'm reading through your book, I mean, the introduction, you tell the very moving story of your health decline and the impact it had on your family, your own mindset. And I related to this again, although I never had the most severe form of chronic fatigue syndrome. I mean, I grew up with it. It was extremely difficult for me to grow up with a chronic, poorly defined illness that had no treatment approach. So it was devastating to all aspects of my life. So I'm wondering, how did you cope with this diagnosis, and what was the factor that made you say, no, I'm not going to accept this, I'm going to do something about it?
Well, it certainly made it far easier to make it through by having a very supportive spouse. And I had two kids, ages 6 and 9. So it was difficult to watch my involvement in their physical lives decline. I'd have to keep reinventing myself, reimagining what my life would be like, what parenting was like. There were a couple of things that were very, very helpful to me. One was a book I'd read, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And one of his concepts was that between every event in your life and your response to it is a space. And in that space, the choice you make defines your character and your legacy. And so, you know, my kids are watching, and I'm thinking I want to teach them how to be resilient and thrive despite difficult times. And so this wasn't the way I wanted to teach them resilience and resourcefulness, but it was, you know, the hand I got dealt. And so as I was struggling with reinventing who I was, I kept thinking, okay, if you want to model resilience for your kids, you have to figure out what are the gifts in this circumstance and how you're going to still lead a meaningful life. And that got me through very tough times. And of course, having a very happy, committed spouse, supportive spouse, also makes all the difference in the world.
That's wonderful. I definitely recommend listeners to read that book if they have not already. And one thing that's so powerful about your story and all of your media talks that are available online is you're instilling hope. You're sharing knowledge, this incredible knowledge that you can actually, yes, you can get better from a chronic illness, but the bigger thing is you're instilling hope. So what is your goal here with all of this information, not only to educate, but to spread this hope and awareness?
Well, I want to create an epidemic of health. For many, many years now, we understand that the root cause of nearly every chronic mental health problem, neurological problem, medical problem, it is diet and lifestyle. 70 to 95% of the risk why people became ill. If I can get them fired up about vegetables, meditative practice, moving their bodies, we can have an epidemic of health. People need fewer drugs, they'll have more energy, there'll be less disability, and there'll be a fall in cancer, fall in autoimmunity, fall in diabetes, fall in heart disease. We'll save the country billions, if not trillions of dollars, and we'll revitalize our economy. So yeah, I want to create an epidemic of health, and it's entirely within our grasp to do that.
It's a very exciting time to be a part of this community, the paleo community, the functional medicine community, because I think you're exactly right. Your niche is with multiple sclerosis. My niche is with chronic fatigue syndrome. But like you mentioned in your book, these are just names that we put on conditions. It doesn't matter what we call it.
What's going wrong in the cell is the same in both diseases. So if we fix the root cause, it dramatically improving nearly every chronic health problem by addressing, nutrition, stress, movement, sleep. It will have huge, profound effects.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for those listening, I encourage you to think about this protocol because it's not just going to be helpful for MS, correct? This is going to be helpful for a multitude of chronic illnesses.
So I have many thousands of followers, and you can go to my website, Terry Wahls, go to the resource pages, look at success stories, and see videos and stories. We have a search bar so you can look for various diagnoses and symptoms. On my Facebook page, we have, again, thousands of followers who are chiming in, talking about the improvement with their chronic fatigue, their fibromyalgia, Parkinson's, mood disorders, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and of course, frankly, hundreds of diseases I've never heard of before who've also been helped.
Okay, I guess we'll wrap this up. I want to thank you so much for speaking with us today. So where can we find out more about your work, your clinical trials, and things that are going on?
So if you go to terrywahls.com, Terry, Wahls, WAHLS.com, we have all that information. We have lots of info, videos. You could sign up. There's a great toxin disease chart that you get when you sign up for the newsletter. And then, of course, you could pick up the book, The Wahls Protocol. It's a tremendous resource, lots of information to get you started in this journey.
I would agree. It's a great book. It's an easy read. It's not too technical for the layperson. And interspersed throughout the book, you have success stories, and really those speak louder than anything else. It's amazing to your Wahls warriors success stories. Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing more and seeing more of your interviews and appearances in the future.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Until next time, this is Spoonie Radio signing off.